I'm your host, Annie Bowles, and this is a bonus episode of News du Jour. Today, we are going to tell the stories of those lost and harmed in Iran through a second-hand source. These stories are vital to relay, but by nature, impossible to verify. So with that, I have to issue a disclaimer here at the top. The views and opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Sugarfree Media or News du Jour podcast. This episode contains content such as violence and graphic descriptions that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. A statement from Amnesty International about the country of Iran, which they have researched extensively, reads, quote, "Thousands of people were interrogated, unfairly prosecuted, and or arbitrarily detained solely for peacefully exercising their human rights, and hundreds remain unjustly imprisoned. Security forces unlawfully used lethal force and birdshot to crush protests. Women, LGBTI people, and ethnic and religious minorities faced entrenched discrimination and violence. Legislative developments further undermined sexual and reproductive rights, the right to freedom of religion and belief, as well as access to the internet. Torture and other ill treatment, including denying prisoners adequate medical care, remain widespread and systematic. Judicial punishments of floggings, amputations, and blinding were imposed. The death penalty was used widely, including as a weapon of repression. Executions were carried out after unfair trials. Systemic impunity prevailed for past and ongoing crimes against humanity related to prison massacres and other crimes under international law." End quote. Thus, as an international community, you guys, we know what goes on in Iran en masse. But today, we're going to hear specific stories from an Iranian woman herself to put names to these senseless acts of cruelty and crimes against humanity, and to further clarify what exactly is going on in Iran. I wanted to give a warm welcome to Elica Le Bon and express my gratitude that you were willing to sit down and put your name alongside these important stories. And thank you for taking time out of your life to do this work. First off,
thank you so much for having me.
Of course. First off, tell us a little bit about your personal story and your relationship with the country of Iran.
So my parents are both, I'm from Iran. My parents are both from Iran. They lived in Iran before the revolution. So the Islamic Revolution happened in 1979, which is how the people of the regime got into power, who are still there now. Before that, my parents lived in Iran. During the time of the revolution, they experienced similar things to what is going on now. My mum was in Evin prison. My aunt was in Evin prison while she was pregnant. Her husband, my uncle, was executed in Evin prison. They eventually left Iran, came to London. That's where I was born. So obviously I have that history of that experience with my own family, and the regime also executed 13 of my family members in total. So I then moved to the US and became a lawyer here. And now I, do the work that I do, which is connected to the criminal justice system. And I do advocacy for that, as well as now Iran, due to the current revolution that's taking place.
I'm so sorry to hear about your family members. I actually did not know that going into this interview. So, my next question was, how did you get into this activism? But it sounds like you were born into it. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do online, though?
Yeah, so it's one of those things where sometimes these things are really you really are born with them because of epigenetics, like especially my cousin, for example, my aunt's baby who she was pregnant with in prison, right? Like that kind of trauma and stress, it's like epigenetically transferred. So I started doing my advocacy after I became a lawyer here in the US, and I started to build up this platform mainly on TikTok. So I rapidly built up this platform on TikTok doing my advocacy, and then I kind of started transferring it over to Instagram as well. And I use Instagram right now almost exclusively as a platform to talk about Iran stuff, particularly because it's not really being discussed much in the media. So I'm trying to be the news for Iran right now.
Well, you're doing a fantastic job, because the stories that we're going to discuss today are not being discussed in the mainstream news. And I want to let everybody know that her Instagram and TikTok pages will be linked in our show notes. So if you guys wanted to check those out, you can see her advocacy work. But she's doing a great job spreading the word. So I wanted to go over a couple terms that we may use really quickly. So IRGC is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or basically a branch of the Iranian armed forces that has been cracking down on protesters. Also, kangaroo court is just, more of a term meaning like a court that's kind of a joke, if you will. Would you describe it that way, Elica?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's not a real court. They just kind of do as they please. So with that, can you tell us a little bit about Iran's decision to execute peaceful protesters? We are approximating 14,000 of them, right?
Yeah. So they have detained upwards of 14,000 peaceful protesters, people who are just like present at the scene of the protest, not people who are being violent, just protesting. This is something that they've done so many times throughout their 43-year reign. This is nothing new or surprising, but the 227 of their 290 seat parliament recently voted to execute all of the prisoners that have been arrested for peacefully protesting. So as we said, that's like 14 to 15,000 of them now. This is behavior that they've repeated many times. In 1988, they did another massacre of Iranian protesters. Anywhere between 5 and 30,000 of them were executed, hanged, because that is their manner of execution. And they've repeated this every time protests erupt. 2009, when we had the Green protests, as in order to serve a chilling effect over protesters. So people will look on and be like, hey, this is what's going to happen to you if you even dare to go against the regime. So it's used as a fear tactic. And now they have voted again, almost unanimously, to do the same thing to these peaceful protesters.
So, really, these current protests, I think everyone, if you follow this podcast, what kicked them off. But can we talk a little bit about maybe what is like the end goal for the protesters? What are they trying to achieve here?
Yeah, so we basically want to get rid of the regime. So we want to get rid of the people that are in power right now, which have created the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is a theocracy, which should not be tolerated anywhere, not just Iran, anywhere. And we want to revert to a democratic state. So back to Iran, not the Islamic Republic. None of these mullahs would be in power, and we would have a democratically elected leader. That's the goal of the revolution.
Perfect. And then in terms of Evin Prison, so we talked on our podcast about the fire that broke out at Evin Prison. So, I've touched on it, and I know that it's, a notorious prison, something akin to like Rikers or Sing Sing here, where we've heard of this prison as being particularly bad. But can you shed some light on what goes on at Evin Prison?
The stuff that goes on at Evin Prison is like unheard of. I mean, it's horrific. You are tortured. You could have your limbs broken, your teeth pulled, your fingers pulled off, whipped, cut, body parts removed, sexually assaulted, raped, and obviously in the final instance executed. They can, deny basic things for your, survival. The conditions, sometimes my aunt said that in the room that she was in, it was like 100 people in a small room. There's not even a space to sit down, like extremely cramped conditions, like very unsanitary, and just vulgar, human rights abuses going on in there. And obviously you have no right to an attorney. I mean, half the time that if you have an attorney representing you, the attorney is jailed too. So, it's like it massively disincentivizes people from even representing the people that need representation, because you don't have the right to an attorney. You don't even have the right to a fair trial. Mm-hmm. The judge on your trial acts as both the judge and the prosecutor. They obviously don't have standards like beyond reasonable doubt. They just, without evidence, decide that you're guilty. You don't have representation, and then that's it. You're sent to death by hanging.
That is awful. And, we do touch on the court system there a little bit on our podcast as well. So listeners probably are familiar with that as well, just that you don't stand a chance of having any sort of real trial. So without further ado, let's jump into some of the stories that we wanted to talk about. So there is a 22-year-old girl named Elmira. Can you tell us a little bit about her story?
Oh, Elmira Hosseini, yeah. So she is somebody who was not even a protester. So this is the thing. You don't have to be actively protesting to get in trouble with the regime. Just any indication that you're against the regime can get you imprisoned and executed. So she was handing out chocolates on the side of the road. And with the chocolates, there was a note that said Zan Zendegi Azadi, which we know now the international community knows means woman, life, freedom. It wasn't even material against the regime. It literally just said woman, life, freedom. But that's enough to implicate you. So she was arrested. And then they told her mother that if she provided her birth certificate, Elmira's birth certificate, they would let her go. And she did provide her birth certificate, but of course they didn't let her go because they were never going to keep their word. And we have no updates on her ever since then.
Okay, and then we had a couple of rappers that we wanted to touch on their stories.
So there is one rapper called Tumaj, who's a very well-known Iranian rapper. And there's another Kurdish rapper called Salman Saidi or Salman Yasin. And both of them have been arrested. Both of them, Salman Saidi has already been given the death sentence, the death penalty. And that is literally just because of making music that has any indication of, talking about the conditions in Iran, the other prisoners, the regime, anything about the state of Iran. So they've been sentenced to death. Tumaj has not yet received his sentence. He hasn't been tried yet. But we anticipate the same thing. And their crimes are a war against God, because the regime sees the government in its collective capacity as a god. So anyone who goes against the regime, they are convicted of going against God, and that is a crime that is punishable by death.
Wow. And I think hand in hand with that is some LGBTQ stories in particular.
So there are two women that we know that are on death row right now, Elham Chubdar and Zahra Seddiqi Hamedani, both LGBTQ women. Both were arrested just because of their LGBTQ status, because homosexuality is a crime, again, that is punishable by death under Sharia law. That is not just in Iran, that is across the board with Sharia law. Also the case in Palestine. So they are on death row right now for being LGBTQ persons as well.
And then Niloufar Hamadi, and she was together with
Elahe.
Yes.
Yeah. Mohammadi. So these two are the journalists that broke the news about Mahsa Amini's death. So journalism, obviously there's no freedom of speech in Iran, and journalism is tied to that democratic function of government accountability and free speech. So that is also a crime in Iran, because it's going against their God, them. They are the God, right? So they were arrested for war on God, same thing, for breaking the news of Mahsa Amini, because the regime has a different story that they put out about Mahsa, which is that she died of a heart problem, not that she was beaten by the Basiji, which are the morality police in Iran. And we also anticipate them to receive death sentences.
And then Amrita Abbasi, 20 years old.
So, yeah, Amrita Abbasi, 20 years old, she went missing during one of the protests, which is a common theme of women who go out and protest in Iran. It's the same thing that happened to Nika Shakarami. And then a while later, they're either discovered in a morgue or in a hospital. So Amrita showed up at a hospital, and the hospital staff discovered that she'd been arrested 8 days earlier at the protest. They found that there was obvious signs of violent rape and sexual assault. The Basiji morality police told the hospital staff that they have to say in their report that the rape occurred pre-arrest, that she had already been raped by the time of her arrest, but they refused to. And then they said that they also told the hospital staff and the family that they have to, if they ever want to see, they told her family that if they ever want to see Amrita again, they have to release this story that she had some problem with diarrhea, and that's why she was in the hospital. Obviously, they refused. So when her family came to see her in the hospital, the Basiji basically kidnapped her half-conscious body, and nobody knows where she is now. By the time her family got there, she was gone.
Wow, and I would imagine there's a lot of missing young women and people in general right now. And so these stories are really representative of just a larger trend, and that's why we're shedding light on them right now. Talk to me about the journalist. Oh, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say that what's problematic about this whole thing is that the stories that we only know them because somehow the news got to us, okay? And this is considering that there's no internet in Iran. I mean, if you try to send a message, if I try to speak with my family in Iran on WhatsApp, it's just one tick. It doesn't even get delivered, right? So the information that we get, it's like it's like one story of literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of girls that are missing. So it's like, it sounds like, oh my gosh, 8 people are in trouble, but it's like there's thousands of them, and this is all we know, you know?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on the internet being turned off because I think that's a huge reason why we're not hearing more about this and seeing more about this. Like, we feel like we're seeing a lot, but it would be just such a huge wave if the internet were turned on there, don't you think?
Well, that's exactly why they switch it off, because, you know, if you think about the way that a democracy works, a government doesn't have control over those faculties, right? Like here in the US, you couldn't just turn off the internet because the internet is a private provider that is not affiliated with the government. But when you look at the way that Iran and theocracies work, the government controls everything. So the government is the internet, the government is everything. So the way that they keep a hold of their power in this way, the way that they prevent their power from being usurped, is that they take all means necessary to hide what they're doing. And one way that they do that is by shutting off the internet, because the internet is Iran's access to the outside world. And the more we see it because the more these stories are released, the more that people pay attention and they're like, what is going on in Iran? Mm-hmm. That's not possible when the internet's shut off. So they shut the internet off with the goal of, containing the violence and containing what they're doing and being able to continue doing what they're doing. But unfortunately for them, there are some very, very clever people in Iran, and they know how to do the VPNs and the hacking and find ways to connect, and we find out. But I did hear that they are now working on entirely shutting off the internet. Mm. And another thing about that is that, when you think about how integral the internet is to just like the survival of anything, like an economy, which is also a problem, right? Think about how much we do with the internet. Like we send work emails, calls, messages, everything that we do is with the internet. If we didn't have internet, most of us probably couldn't do our jobs realistically, So that's the condition that they're in as well. They can't even get by on a daily basis because of these chokeholds.
Yeah, this is all headed towards like a very severe crisis. We're already there, but it's getting worse and worse by the day. And we're kind of in the middle of a bunch of stories here, but I did want to emphasize too the importance of saying names. So did you want to kind of speak on that really quickly of just like, the importance of that?
So people always ask, what can we do for Iran? It seems so pointless. And it feels that way. I feel it too. It's really a tough emotion to deal with. But there are some things that we, as the diaspora have observed over time that seem to do something. One of them is saying their names. So this we learned for maybe the first time in 2020, where there were 3 young boys in Iran who were sentenced to death because they were protesting over gas prices after the sanctions, right? So protesting is a crime punishable by death in Iran, as we know by now. Again, same thing, war on God. And then the international community actually got a hold of this story. When I say that, I mean that the news media outlets were talking about it. I remember reading about it in the news, in The Guardian, The Independent, those are British newspapers. And after the international media attention, Iran, the Islamic Republic, commuted their sentence. So they went from the death penalty to life in prison, and then eventually it was reduced to 5 years. So we know that when the names are known to the international community, when people are talking about it, when there is an uproar, there has been a trend that they don't execute those people because it is going to galvanize and incite more violence and sedition. So since observing this trend, we have kind of orchestrated these campaigns as the diaspora, say their names to save their lives campaigns. So we ask people to just like share like crazy any names that we, get out of Iran and their stories and their pictures, in the hopes that if they gain enough international traction, that they won't be executed.
Absolutely. And so we're keen to try and share the names as much as we can. With that said, let's jump into the journalist who was taken mid-interview.
Hossein Ronaki, yes. So he is an activist, and he was doing an interview in his home at the time when the IRGC came to his home and attempted to kidnap him. I don't know how he did it, but he managed to escape. However, after he escaped, he was told that his friends and family would be harmed if he didn't turn himself in to Evin prison. obviously these threats are serious. They have the names and addresses of all his friends and family. He's not going to put his, parents, siblings' lives at risk. So he did what he felt like he needed to do. So he turned himself into Evin Prison with his lawyer. Both of them were beaten. He was beaten unconscious, so he fainted at the entrance of Evin Prison. They then took him into the prison and they broke both of his legs and his finger. And people from inside the prison said that they saw him being dragged because he can't walk. He was being dragged from left to right. He was being dragged from the confession room to solitary confinement, back to the confession room. And in all cases, they're always just being beaten and tortured the entire time. And he is denied medical assistance and obviously denied access to a lawyer.
So when it comes to Evin Prison now, like after the fire, have you heard anything about whether it's operational right now or if everyone's been moved to other prisons?
I haven't heard about anyone being moved. So I very much doubt that they would move anyone because they have no interest in protecting the prisoners. So ever since the fire, from what we know, there was, a number of deaths, 140 plus deaths. And then there was no information after that. There was obviously no accountability and there was no updates on what happened. So we just assumed that the people that were there that survived are just there, and that's it.
And there's a good chance that that number of 150 is really underreported. Would you agree with that? I thought I had read that from Amnesty.
Yeah, I mean, because you're relying on eyewitnesses when you're asking like the number of people that were killed, you're relying on people. I mean, this number that we got was from a percipient witness who said that they saw just like bodies on top of bodies. And their estimate was like, it looked like more than 150 or whatever his estimate was.
Wow.
We also don't know the numbers of people that he didn't see. Like there's just really no way to know, which is really sad. But we know that it's a lot. That's as much as we know.
So next I wanted to kind of touch on the international community and kind of their lack of action and, maybe we could touch on what they could be doing, the UN specifically and news outlets rejecting coverage, etc.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's really confusing in general because these people have an incentive to actually talk about Iran. I mean, this regime, the Islamic Republic, has so many enemies. One of its biggest enemies is Israel, right? And so I think of, I know that Israel and, you can't say that every like Jewish community is connected to Israel necessarily, but I know that certain media outlets that have, Jewish editors and journalists, I would think that they would be wanting to talk about this because they'd be like, finally someone's exposing this regime that we've been against for so long. And they're seeing what we've been saying and no one was listening to us, right? So it's a bit confusing. Maybe they don't want to be political, I'm not sure, but it's a bit confusing why so many people are not interested in taking advantage of, this opportunity to really let rip on the Islamic Republic of Iran. So none of us can really make sense of it. Some people are like, oh, well, it's because the US is trying to drum up an oil deal with Iran. And it's like, but journalism is not tied to the government. Like the media doesn't, go hand in hand with whatever agenda the government has. In fact, the media is there to criticize the government. That is literally the purpose of the printing press, why it was established. So that to me doesn't sound right either. I have no answers for it. I have no answers for why they don't care. It could just go back to the same thing when, the whole Ukraine thing happened and it was like they, it came to light that they were only interested in people who, are white, blonde hair, blue eyes. I don't know. That could be, it could just be like, well, you know what, the Middle East is a mess. It's always been a mess, so we don't care. I don't have an explanation for it.
Wow, human rights should never be a political thing regardless. There's just so many human rights violations that to me it doesn't even feel political. And it really is so underreported right now. I feel like social
Yeah.
media is way more inundated when it comes to
I
the
know.
story
And that's
than
what's so crazy about it, because that's another thing. It's like not I get, but it's understandable why the media wouldn't report on stuff if they think that people are not interested, right? Like, this is not newsworthy, no one's going to read it.
yeah.
But the public is literally pouring out support.
Yeah.
And it's like, where can I find information about this? Where can I read the news? And it's like, the people are interested, so why aren't you? The only other thing I can think about is that they don't want to report on something without a reliable source, a news source. And obviously, we know that we can't share information about the sources. So that might be another concern they have. But there's ways around that. Like, there's disclaimers, which is what we've discussed, right?
Yeah.
Like, you just drop a disclaimer. We don't know for sure the exact source, but this is the information.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, we know these atrocities are happening on like a very large scale. So while these
Right.
particular stories, the details and the ins and outs of the particulars, we may not know them for sure, but like we know disappearances and torture and all these things are happening en masse. Like it's not just
Right.
it's not just this handful of people that we've discussed today. It's happening by the hundreds, if not thousands, and it should be easy enough to speak on a few situations.
Right.
But
I mean, you can at least share the information that the parliament voted to,
yeah.
Execute 15,000 protesters. That's not a myth. That's a fact. You can get that information from the Islamic Republic of Iran directly.
Exactly. So to circle back around to the UN, though, what could they be doing that they're not?
Well, they're supposed to be orchestrating a human rights council, to a mechanism to investigate the human rights violations in Iran. From my understanding, we, the diaspora, have been pushing for that, directly urging the UN to set up that mechanism for human rights investigations. And the last thing that I heard was that a representative from the Islamic Republic made some phone call or something to the UN and was like, don't do this, was urging them not to do it. It seems like an obvious way to, I guess, like just begin some process of accountability.
Yeah.
But it hasn't happened yet. Again, no idea why.
Wow. And for our last question today, I wanted to discuss like if you are looking at the best case scenario, like a situation in which the women of Iran win this, what does that look like? And what is a plausible path to that for the women of Iran?
I mean, from my perspective, I don't even think plausible is the word. Like, it's going to happen. It's just a question of when, So at some point, these people are just going to leave. They're going to get tired because they're not going to be able to control us anymore. And what that looks like to me is that somebody who the people want, somebody who the people love, is going to take the reins in Iran, a democratically elected person, and the women of Iran are going to enjoy all the freedoms that they deserve. They're going to enjoy the freedom to show their hair if they choose. They might not choose to do that. They're going to enjoy the freedom to dress however they want. They're going to enjoy the freedom to speak about whatever they want. They're going to be able to use social media platforms the way we use social media platforms. They're going to be able to do dances on TikTok if that's what they feel like doing. They are going to be able to live with the freedom of not having a theocracy and fundamentalist religion controlling their every living existence. So that's what the women of Iran can expect. It's just a question of when.
A special thanks to Elica Le Bon and our legal team at Page Hulse Law for making this episode possible. If you want to help out with what's going on in Iran, head to Elica's TikTok or Instagram page. Both are linked in our show notes, and click the link in her bio for further instructions. Signing petitions, resharing to social, and sharing this podcast episode with friends and family is a great way to spread the word and help keep eyes on what the Iranian government is doing to its own people. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a patron of our podcast. For $7.99 a month, you can unlock tons of perks like breaking news text messages so that you're never out of the loop. Tons of bonus episodes are already up there ready for you to binge, and a discussion board full of networking opportunities and much more. Go to www.patreon.com/sugarfree media today to become a patron. This is the best way to support our show. Our patrons make News du Jour possible. But a couple other ways to support our podcast are rate and review on whatever podcast platform you use to listen, share on your social media, you have influence, tell your friends, family, and colleagues that you love News du Jour and why you listen. You can also follow us on social media under sugarfreemedia.co on Instagram, just Sugarfree Media, all one word, on TikTok, and sugarfree_media on Twitter. We also have a weekend newsletter called Dreamers Digest that's full of dreamy content recommendations for your weekend and a life update from yours truly. Sign up today on our website, www.sugarfreemedia.co. Our music is by Joey Lavoie and Nicholas Foster. Our cover art is by Hannah Pierce Photography. Our Sugarfree Media logo is by Catherine Jezik Designs. Any twinkling or little footsteps you might hear in the background are by my dog, Rhett. He's a rescue pup and always records with me. We appreciate you listening and look forward to telling you about the news again next time on News du Jour. Broadcasting from Oklahoma.